Okay, we are live.
We are.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Mentionables Live. We are back tonight with part 2 of a video we watched a few weeks back. And we ran into some connectivity issues and couldn't finish it last time. Looks like we may be off to a similar start tonight. So we will see. But we are in-house and all connected for the time being. So, of course, I'm Caleb Johnston. Down here below me is the one and only
Joel Furchess. Yo.
And over this way, I pointed right direction this time.
Yep, Clinton Wilcox.
Glad to have both you guys with me tonight. What? Oh,
He was pointing up at me.
I thought he was telling me to turn the volume up there for a moment.
Okay. Maybe he was telling you to pump up the jams.
Fair enough, yeah. We've got baby trying to sleep in the background, so I've got lullabies. If it comes too loud, then let me know, and I will try and turn it down. But if I cut it too low, she'll probably hear my voice over them and wake up. So it's going to be a fun balancing act tonight.
Uh-huh.
All right. So, you guys ready to get started in this? Either of you want to give us a recap of a little bit of what the video was about from last time, just to kind of give viewers an introduction? Of course, they can always go back and watch part 1. It's like 2 weeks ago. Once we finish production on this episode, I'll throw a link so it'll pop up like right here or something right now. But for the time being, you can go back in our channel and catch part 1. Same title, just no part 2 attached to it.
Possibly somebody who was able to connect during the last call should summarize it.
Well, as I remember, I mean, it's been a couple weeks, and coronavirus lockdown has like all the days is kind of running together. So I'll see how much I can remember from last time. The host of this program, Closer to Truth, whose name escapes me at the moment, was asking certain atheistic scientists about what he considers to be fallacies in trying to prove that God exists. Those, if I recall correctly, I think Richard Dawkins was one of the scientists. Atkins, I think, was another scientist. Peter Atkins, I think, was his name.
Yep.
And was Sam Harris one?
No, I have Peter Atkins, Victor Stinger, Michael Tooley, Walter Sennett Armstrong, and Dennis Alexander.
Okay, yeah, Michael Tooley is a philosopher, not a scientist, but he was the one that we watched, and I think Walter Sennett Armstrong is the next one that we were going to be getting to. So he asked the scientists had really, really bad arguments, about what they consider to be bad arguments for God's existence, totally leading astray the host of Closer to Truth, because they were actually, number one, they were misrepresenting some of the arguments, but number two, the arguments they were trying to get at are actually good arguments for God's existence. They weren't tackling the bad arguments. So that whole show is kind of misleading for that reason. And then, of course, he gets to Michael Tooley, and Michael Tooley, of course, is a philosopher, so he understands better than these other scientists how to think well, and so he, didn't really present any sort of fallacies or anything in arguing for God's existence, but he did make some points to show why someone might not think that it's a cut and dry, open and shut case, that kind of thing. I don't remember exactly what his argument was, but yeah, it was it was a little better than what the scientists were saying.
Yeah, that's fair, and it's been a couple of weeks. I've watched dozens of things since then, so I don't remember everything either. Especially when you respond to a bunch of these videos, it's hard to remember any specific one. But I do remember that my impression from this video was I really like this YouTube channel now. I mean, it seems to be doing a good job trying to present fair information. which I can certainly appreciate. And the host seems relatively neutral in terms of presenting things. So,
yeah, and he has actually interviewed Christian philosophers in the past. I know he's interviewed William Lane Craig. He's interviewed Alvin Plantinga. I want to say he's interviewed Peter Van Inwagen, but he might not have. I think he's interviewed a few others, but yeah. So he has interviewed Christian thinkers too. But yeah,
Wow. William Lane Craig will interview with anybody, won't he?
Yeah. So yeah, but the scientists that he interviewed were just really, really bad. No real way to sugarcoat that.
Well, I think we've got 2 of them left. We've got a little under half of this video. I rewound it a little bit so we wouldn't be in the middle of an interview when we started our clip. So we'll dive back in. As with last time, when you guys see a point you want to stop, oh boy, yeah, this is going to be fun. So yeah, if you see somewhere you want to stop, just throw your hand up and I'll pause it when we do that.
Okay, do you want me to wave it around like I just don't care?
Yeah.
All right.
That'll be perfect.
Okay, cool.
I wish I could remember the next line.
Well, I mean, it's been used in a lot of songs, so you can take your pick.
True. All right, we'll give Mr. Furches a chance to return.
Okay.
And then we will kick this thing off. Let's throw this banner up there for fun.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. I get fancy playing around with the software when I have time. Yeah. All right, there he is. All right, we're going to start
like 3 more times and then drop out entirely.
All right, well, we'll miss you if you go.
Mm-hmm.
But we will continue on without you if we must. All right, we're diving into the video now.
Yeah, right. This video doesn't like me.
No, it doesn't. Did the same thing last time.
I want to find them and I want to kill.
It looks like that's what he said.
That's why I hate these fallacies. I want to find them and I want to kill them. So I search for more. I meet Duke philosopher Walter Sennett Armstrong, a font of anti-God fallacies.
Walter, you don't believe in God, right? Not only do I not believe in God, I believe God does not exist. Okay, good. You have spent part of your career, small part, but a part, looking at the arguments of some pretty smart people who believe in the existence of God, right? Yes. What are some of the fallacies that you see in those arguments? One example is what I call the fallacy of bloated conclusions. You get some premises that will yield one conclusion, which is a pretty weak conclusion, and then you bloat it up so it looks like you've really proven the existence of God. And one example of this would be Aquinas' cosmological argument. He argues that something must have created the universe. There must have been a first cause, okay? He says, therefore, God exists. Well, it doesn't follow that anything like the traditional Christian God exists. Something could have created the universe and died the next day. You don't even know if it still exists. You don't know whether it's good. You don't know whether it's eternal. You don't know whether it's a person. Another example is religious experience. You know, when people have a religious experience, that leads them to believe in God. But how does...
Okay, so yeah, so Sennett Armstrong here is not really saying anything interesting when he says that it doesn't necessarily lead you to the Christian God. Because then you can just ask, okay, so what? Is the argument true or is it not true? If it's true, well, then Aquinas shows that it needed a first cause. So then the next question is, well, what is this first cause? Then you investigate that first cause further. And there are other arguments, which William Lane Craig would say we use in a cumulative case for God's existence. And so if you want to know whether that God is a good God or not, we have the moral argument to make that case. And if we want to know whether it's the Christian God or not, well, we have the argument from Christ's resurrection, which shows that the God that exists is the Christian God. So we have different arguments for different facets of what we're trying to argue. And William Lane Craig then would use his Kalam cosmological argument, of course, which he argues that because all things that begin to exist require a cause, since the universe began to exist, the universe requires a cause. And then he takes that conclusion. He doesn't bloat it up like Senator Armstrong is saying, but he says that there are certain features of this cause of the universe that we can infer from the fact that this cause created the universe, so we can infer certain things from it, because matter, time, and energy, for example, began at the Big Bang. So if a cause caused the universe to come into existence, then we can at least infer that this cause is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, because there was no time, space, or matter before the universe began. So you can infer certain things about this first cause.
Yeah, and that makes some of his statements too, from, if you understand this argument and what you can infer, some of his statements just show he has no idea about the actual argument, because he says, well, this being could have created the universe and died the next day. You're talking about, for death to occur the next day, you're really talking about a temporal being, not something that is beyond time. The inference, like you said, is that this could be a timeless being. And so to say it could die the next day is almost an absurd statement.
Well, yeah, I get it. Well, again, you would infer that from the Kalam argument. You couldn't infer that from Aquinas' first cause argument, because at that time, Aquinas didn't believe he could prove the universe had a beginning. So Aquinas' arguments actually didn't depend on the universe beginning in time. The universe could have been eternal, and Aquinas' arguments still work. So just for clarity...
That's a good distinction.
Yeah, for clarity's sake, you would infer that from the Kalam argument, not from Aquinas' first cause argument, which is the argument that Senator Armstrong is addressing here.
Something interesting about the first cause argument as expressed by Crud, what's his name? The philosopher after Plato, Aristotle. Yeah. So one of the interesting things about that is Aristotle struggled with how could the unmoved mover, kick things off and also not change. And so he came to the conclusion that the unmoved mover would have to kind of draw things into existence by its very nature versus pushing things into existence. So he used the example of the way a dish of milk would attract a cat. The unmoved mover, the prime mover, would essentially attract things into existence by its very nature.
I had not heard that.
Yeah.
But then again, I haven't read everything that Aristotle has written.
Really? You haven't?
Yeah, well, I've read some Aristotle, but I've also read a lot of what the modern Aristotelian philosophers have written, because, as brilliant as Aristotle was and as brilliant as Aquinas was, philosophy should keep moving forward. And so modern Aristotelian philosophers have taken what the previous generations have taught and, run with it, improved upon it, that kind of thing.
For me, it was like Dr. Seuss and then Aristotle and then...
Yep, Dr. Seuss.
Hey.
Oh,
well, there he goes again.
He goes again.
Serves him right for, trying to make some bad jokes here. So,
right.
All right.
You want to wait for him to come back in before we continue, or?
Well, I'd say we would, but I don't want to make this boring for any viewers either. So.
Okay.
I was trying to think if there's any other points I wanted to make on what he said here. I think we've covered it. Oh, he's going into. Let me rewind for just this because he moves on to this second kind of point here after that. So let's.
Eternal. You don't know whether it's a person. Another example is religious experience. When people have a religious experience, that leads them to believe in God. But how do
religious experience?
Mm-hmm. Were you going to comment on that? Or
Yeah, I think
okay.
I think it's interesting that people refer to this one so much. And granted, from a lot of the schools of Christianity that I've grown up in, largely that's what's encouraged within the church, is not an apologetic methodological approach to sharing things with people and discussing issues. It's this: give them your testimony, and it which largely is from personal experience in many cases. So I understand where people are coming from when they say this is an argument that people give. Yes, they do, but it's not really an argument in that sense of it. It's one data point. We're getting one data point on somebody, and if we have a lot of people with experiences that are the same, maybe we get some more validity. But so do many other religions have those. So I think you have to take all that and compare it with what kind of evidence we have historically and with what kind of reasoning we can gather through philosophy to really get a comprehensive picture of, okay, how can we account for these experiences? All right, let's see. I just heard something from Joel here. He is ditching us, or his computer's ditching us. So,
all right,
we'll keep rolling along.
So we will be sans Joel for tonight.
Yep.
They know that the thing they experience is all powerful or all good or all knowing or good at all for that matter. And so they bloat the conclusion up, usually in line with the religious tradition that they're familiar with. Okay, another.
I don't know about you. This guy's really frustrating. He seems to be just conflating everything together into these 1 or 2 points rather than actually considering that these things are broken down and they're different questions than the ones he's dealing with. I've never heard anybody, make the claim that God is all-knowing from their personal experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's something, we can know from Revelation. Scripture teaches that, God, teaches many of the attributes of God. But of course, then the question is, well, how do you know that the Bible is reliable? In which case we can present arguments for the reliability of Scripture. So we can go that route. We can say we know it through Revelation. But, there are other routes you can go. Like you can go Anselm's route and say that God is the greatest conceivable being, and that being the greatest conceivable being means that God has all great making properties to their maximal extent. He's maximally great being, and so if that's true, then God's knowledge must be maximal also. So there are different ways that you can go to show the all-knowingness of God, but it's also something we can know from Revelation because it's what Scripture teaches, and so we have reasons to believe that Scripture is reliable. So there's that route too. So yeah, I think he says that it's a bloated conclusion, but and considering that Senator Armstrong, who I believe is a philosopher, I don't necessarily want to say that he's ignorant of these arguments because I'm sure he's heard them.
Right.
But I think I'm sure it's probably just a case that he believes that God doesn't exist, and so rather than being charitable toward theistic arguments, he thinks that they're just all a bunch of hooey. It's kind of what it sounds like to me. Like he just dismisses them, which is not something a philosopher ought to do, but it really sounds like it's what he's doing.
And I think that's fair. And I appreciate you bringing that insight. I'm not familiar with him, so I think that's probably the fairest way we could consider this, because he's really bloating his own straw man at this point.
Yeah, I think William Lane Craig has probably debated everybody on this broadcast here, except for the host, of course. But I'm pretty sure all of these have been debated by William Lane Craig.
Well, then they should definitely know the arguments a little better than they're presenting.
Right. That's true of every atheist, though.
True.
Fallacy. Excessive footnotes. I love the fallacy of excessive footnotes. And that's simply that some people, when they give these arguments, they cite authority after authority after authority. They want to say, well, you need to believe in the Big Bang. And once you believe in the Big Bang, then something had to cause the Big Bang, and that must have been God. And so they cite authority after authority about the Big Bang, and they show that they understand the physics and cite the laws. Another favorite is to cite as an authority the atheists themselves. A theist will cite an atheist as an authority for what the theist wants to say, and they go, gotcha, But I don't have to agree with everything all atheists say. I mean, there's lots of atheists who said stupid things. Other arguments. Another argument is false dichotomy. People will...
Yeah, so just real quick, I don't know exactly how Senator Armstrong is using the term fallacy, but I've read several logic texts and books on fallacies, and I've never heard the fallacy of bloated conclusion or the fallacy of excessive footnotes. So I think those are just a couple of names for fallacies that he kind of made up, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad to use them per se, because it could just be observations he observed and then just made a name for it. But I've never heard of those fallacies recognized by any of the logic texts I've read or books on fallacies. So
yeah, and I think that excessive footnotes. It could be true, could be not, but it doesn't mean anything in and of itself.
And it kind of sounds like he wants to like it's sort of similar to the argument from authority fallacy,
right?
Except that the argument from authority fallacy is only a fallacy if the authorities you're quoting are illegitimate authorities. If you're quoting actual authorities, then you're not committing any sort of fallacy. So,
yeah, exactly.
Okay, but here, false dichotomy definitely is a recognized fallacy. So let's see what he has to say.
Maybe this will be a little better.
Saddle the atheist with the position. Well, you must believe either this or this, but that can't be right, so we must be right. So they'll say, for example, they'll say the universe must have begun either by chance or through law or through a designer. And so as an atheist, I go, well, I don't know which one to pick because I'm not sure what they mean by it. And then the dichotomy would be the law chance on one side and the personal Judeo-Christian God on the other. Right. And that indeed is a false dichotomy because there are innumerable explanations that are not either one of those. From a logical point of view, you have not exhausted the universe of possibilities at all by setting up that dichotomy. Exactly. So another fallacy is...
Okay, so yeah, so he seems to be talking about William Lane Craig's argument, teleological argument, where the universe, or the fine-tuning argument, rather, that fine-tuning in the universe was either due to chance, to necessity, or to a designer. Now, that is, strictly speaking, is not a false dichotomy because Craig's argument is not a dilemma. False dichotomy would actually be if you're presenting a dilemma and you're only presenting two choices, but there are other choices you could present. That's what a false dichotomy would be, or another term for it is a false dilemma. In this case, he's not using a dilemma, which is an argument form, a syllogism form. He's actually Dr. Craig's argument is actually a disjunctive syllogism, where he presents one case or one case or one case. He's arguing that it's not these two, so it must be the third one that he presents. So in this case, it's not really a false dichotomy. And if there are anything that could potentially be the reason for the fine-tuning of the universe, then we could just throw that in among the other choices, and then it would be chance, necessity, designer, or whatever this fourth possibility would be, and then we could investigate it. So yeah, this argument here, and I don't know if it's made by any other philosophers. I mean, I know Dr. Craig uses his moral argument, and I know that there are other philosophers who formulate the argument differently than he does. So I don't know how many philosophers actually use this same formulation. But the argument that Senator Armstrong seems to be referring to is in the form of a disjunctive syllogism, not in the form of a dilemma.
Okay. And now I'm not super familiar with Craig's argument, but it doesn't specify the Judeo-Christian God, though, right?
No, it just says it's basically it's arguing for a designer. It doesn't argue anything about what this designer is. And again, William Lane Craig would say, I'm using these arguments in a cumulative case. So yeah, the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't get you to the Christian God. The teleological argument or the fine-tuning argument doesn't get you to the Christian God. The moral argument doesn't get you to the Christian God. But he presents a fourth argument, the argument from Christ's resurrection, and that does get him to the Christian God. So he argues from these four arguments that the universe requires a cause, that the fine-tuning of the universe requires a designer, that the existence of objective moral facts and duties requires a moral lawgiver, and this cause, designer, and moral lawgiver is the Christian God who came down in the form of Jesus Christ as a man and was crucified on the cross and rose again 3 days later.
So I give Robert Kahn is the host here.
Okay.
And I give him credit then, at least when he rephrased things, he did put it in the form of a false dichotomy. Because he specifically said, it's either chance or the Judeo-Christian God.
Well, yeah, that's not a false dichotomy, though. That's a disjunction.
Okay.
Now, yeah, Senator Armstrong, I'm sure, is trained in logic, so he may not be speaking, strictly, using the formal definitions of these terms, but he should, because he's a philosopher. And so if you present something, for example, if I were to say, let's see, the walls in my bedroom are either white or red. You could say, that's a false dichotomy, because there are a number of different colors that it could be. But I know what the colors of my bedroom are, and so if I'm trying to make some sort of point about the colors of my bedroom, I could say, for example, if I want to put it in the form of a disjunctive syllogism, I would say that the walls in my bedroom are either blue or white. The walls in my bedroom are not white, therefore they are blue. And so that would be a disjunctive syllogism. Now, it could be the case that it could be red, because that's obviously a color, and my bedroom walls could be colored red. That's certainly within the realm of possibility. So we would say then that when I say they're either white or blue, we would say then that I'm not presenting a false dichotomy. What we would actually say is that I'm not using or exhaustively, it could be used to include other colors or anything like that. So if I were to say that they're either blue or white, if I were to say they're not blue, therefore they must be white, well, that might be fallacious thinking, because they could be other colors. But so if I'm making the argument then, and I say that my bedroom walls are either blue or white, they are blue, therefore they're not white, that would be a more logical way of arguing that. So that's a little bit of a roundabout way of saying it, because I kind of had to pull that example out of thin air. But yeah, basically when we talk about a false dichotomy, it's usually, colloquially it would be, well, you're presenting two different choices, but there are others, so this is a false dichotomy. But strictly speaking, regarding logic, it's not really a false dichotomy unless you're making a dilemma. And a dilemma says, A is true, if A is true, then B occurs, or if C is true, then D occurs. A or C are true, therefore B or D occurs. And that's kind of the form of a dilemma. And so, that's then where you would say that, if there's some possibility F, well then A or C are not the only possibility. So therefore, that's a false dilemma that's being offered. So
I think that's a great clarification. I appreciate that.
did I clarify? Because I kind of felt like I was rambling a little bit.
No, I think it made sense, and we are totally going to school with Clinton Wilcox on logic tonight. So I love it.
Okay, yeah, and like I said, it's possible that Senator Armstrong was just speaking, colloquially, but Robert Kuhn is asking for fallacies, and so if we're going to talk about fallacies, a fallacy doesn't necessarily need to be a logical fallacy, because a fallacy could just be an error in reasoning. But if you're looking for fallacies, and Walter Senator Armstrong wants to say, well, there's a false dichotomy going on, then it really seems like we ought to be using these terms correctly, in the way that they're actually defined. And so if we're going to appeal to, for example, Dr. Craig's fine-tuning argument, well, that's in the form of a disjunctive syllogism. It's not in the form of a dilemma. So you can't really argue that it's a false dichotomy that's being set up.
It makes sense to me, and I think the example you gave was good, because it certainly gave that distinction for me anyway.
Okay, hopefully that was clear to anyone listening. I kind of felt like I was rambling a little bit because I wasn't prepared to come and give a lesson on logic. But those are just kind of my initial thoughts based on what Senator Armstrong is responding with here.
Well, I think we're doing good so far.
All right.
Is equivocation. Very often, a term will be used in different ways in the course of the same argument, and you can make one step when it means one thing. But then you can't make the later step. For universe, for example, sometimes means just the physical universe as we experience it and what we live in. Sometimes it includes God. Sometimes it includes what happened before the Big Bang. That term gets thrown around and used in many different ways, and that creates problems in a lot of the arguments that use that concept. How about another fallacy?
Well, another very common fallacy is the straw man fallacy. One example of that is when theists say that atheists must believe that nothing's really morally right or wrong. There's no objective morality. Well, atheism doesn't imply anything of the sort. So you're going to be able to make fun of atheists and get people to turn against atheists by ascribing to atheists a position that they don't hold.
With all of these fallacies,
Okay, so he's kind of misrepresenting the arguments here. He talked about equivocation, and equivocation is possible, but if you're debating someone and you've defined your terms and you're using the terms the same way in each of your premises, well, then there's no equivocation going on. So the term universe could be used in a few different ways, but if you're making the argument and you're using the term universe in the same way in each of your premises, well, then there's no equivocation going on, and they have to address the argument as it's presented. And then regarding the straw man, he's actually attacking a straw man of the moral argument. There's probably some Christian somewhere in some backwoods community that says, atheists just all, they must all be rapists and murderers because they, there's no reason to believe that anything is right or wrong, if God doesn't exist. But if we're talking about, smarter people than that, we don't say that atheists can't believe in right or wrong. We don't say that atheists can't do right or wrong. What the argument is that, he's right, that on atheism, you cannot ground the existence of objective moral values or duties. But that doesn't mean, like he insinuates, it doesn't mean that we believe that atheists are just all immoral people, that they're, doing all manner of evil things, that they can't believe in right or wrong. All it says is that atheism cannot ground objective morality. And so, the reason for that is because if there's nothing outside of humanity that can set the rules and can hold human beings accountable, well, then it's up to each individual to determine what's right or wrong, or it's up to the society. And different societies might have different opinions about what's right or wrong. So atheism does imply, as many atheists have pointed out, that there are no objective moral values or duties. But that doesn't mean that atheists can't believe in them. It just means that they can't ground it with their atheism.
I think that's a good distinction. And, when you were talking about, this not being, this being a straw man of the moral argument, it occurred, there was an event in the news this week I don't know if you've heard of it yet, but it was interesting because essentially this college professor, in a comedic manner, parodied kind of this to say that people are evil. And
Oh,
he got
was it the Little Hitler song?
yeah
Yeah, I heard about that.
yeah
He got like fired. He was a tenured professor, and he was like fired from a Christian university, no less,
yeah
for essentially teaching Christian doctrine in a humorous song.
yeah. It blew my mind that they would fire him over that. It was comedic. Yeah, people don't like Hitler references, period. But yeah, mind blowing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the left think that we have another Hitler in the White House. So the left is not above using Hitler metaphors when describing somebody that they don't like. So
yeah, they've been pretty frequent with that.
yeah.
All right.
Some of them emerging from what we would both consider very smart people, philosophers. Why do you think these occur?
So when they really want to believe something, people start deciding on the conclusion first and constructing the arguments later. That's when you typically get fallacies.
I mean, that's true, but the atheist is not exempt from that.
Mm-hmm.
The atheist can very well start with the conclusion God doesn't exist and then come up with fallacious arguments. But starting with a conclusion does not necessitate that your argument will be fallacious. I do teach logic to homeschool students, and in the intro to logic class I teach, one of the lessons is actually on how to construct an argument. And usually what we do is we start with the conclusion, and then we teach them how to come up with premises that can lead to that conclusion. And that's not a fallacious way of reasoning, because there are rules that you have to follow in order to construct a valid syllogism. So because if a syllogism is valid and the premises are true, and I'm talking, of course, of a deductive syllogism, if it's valid and the premises are true, then the conclusion is inescapable. It doesn't matter if you start with the conclusion. You can start with the conclusion and still end up with a valid and sound argument if you understand the rules that go into creating a sound or a valid argument.
I bet the kids' parents love you after teaching them that class as they're reasoning their way to later bedtimes and.
Yeah, so far I haven't had any parents upset with me about that, but one of these days it may happen.
It's bound to eventually.
Right.
Walter relishes fallacies. He loves exposing bad arguments for God, revealing obvious blunders or hidden inconsistencies. To me, these bad arguments are not strangers. I've met them all on the front lines of the science-religion battle. For believers, they are pitfalls and stumbling blocks. By twisting logic to try to prove that God exists, bad arguments suck their gullible proponents down the sinkhole of embarrassing error.
Now,
ad time.
Yeah, we're getting an ad, so I'm gonna go to it works out because I was gonna make a comment there anyway. Is that that last statement he made? I do somewhat agree with it. A lot of people do get sucked down into these bad argument sinkholes. I mean, I can point out whole organizations that kind of do that, but it doesn't mean that everybody does.
Yeah, it's especially puzzling because he has interviewed Christian philosophers before, and these philosophers. I mean, you don't really expect these scientists to, especially if you've read some of their writings. Like I've read The God Delusion. I don't expect Richard Dawkins to hold any sort of charitability to people he disagrees with, but you would expect that of philosophers because they have a principle of charity, and so these, Michael Tooley didn't seem so much, but it's been a couple weeks. I might be remembering it correctly, but Walter Sennett Armstrong is definitely very dismissive about these arguments, and philosopher, I'm trying to be charitable here to the atheist philosophers. They should recognize that Christian philosophers are very much educated in reasoning well, and so to insinuate that even Christian philosophers start with the conclusion and then create fallacious arguments when they understand fallacies and how to avoid fallacies, to insinuate that Christian philosophers start with the conclusion and then construct fallacious arguments to prove that conclusion is just very, very uncharitable from this philosopher.
Yeah, I would agree. I was a little taken aback by that last one. Compared to everybody else, I don't know, just something rubbed me the wrong way in his approach. All right.
So why is it, after uncovering the fallacies of proving God and discarding them all as impotent frauds, that I am still not willing to discard God? Why does my hope survive? I bring the fallacy question to a scientist who believes in God. I go to Cambridge, England, to meet the director of the Faraday Institute of Science and Religion, Dennis Alexander.
Oh, never mind.
I think.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking. I thought he looked like Francis Collins at first, and then
that's exactly what I thought too. Watching him walk behind the shelves, it's like, oh, is that Collins?
Yeah. Okay, so who did he say this scientist is?
Dennis Alexander.
Alexander. Okay.
God of the gaps sort of ideas are very, very common, in the history of apologetics, how believers try and justify their beliefs. And usually what often they do is to point to something that we don't yet in science understand very well, like the origin of life or the bacterial flagellum, how exactly it came into being or something like that, and then they say, here's a gap in the scientific story. So God did it, and they bring God in to just sort of explain those kind of current gaps and sort of ignorance that we have at the moment. And of course, what happens obviously is that those gaps close, the scientific story gets better, and that God sort of shrinks. And sometimes people have, used brain science and things. Well, the mind is something we can't really understand. It's some way God is located in the mind in a way that's a bit spooky and mysterious. And now, of course, neuroscience has begun to understand the brain in a much more thorough way, although very much incomplete way. But I think it's very dangerous, to put a sort of gap there in the mind as if somehow that's the special location of God. So I think the God of the gaps argument in all its various exemplars, has been very, very kind of misused over the years.
If we look at the history of religion and science, we see science.
Okay, so this is why I'm actually pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? Sympathetic to certain philosophers who say we really shouldn't be using scientific arguments to try to argue for God. Thomistic philosophers, I think, usually make this case. Like, I think Ed Feser is probably one, and there are others who would say we really shouldn't use science to argue for it because science is ever changing. And so, we believe that the universe had a beginning in time now, but there may come a time when science has discovered evidence that overturns the Big Bang, and they take some kind of different view of the origin of the universe. And we saw this happen with William Paley's watchmaker argument, where the teleological argument of Paley's watchmaker used to be all the rage, but that argument has kind of fallen out of favor with the rise of Darwinian evolution and survival of the fittest and those kinds of things. So now the teleological argument is no longer Paley's design argument about finding a watch and something much more complex than a watch like the universe requires a designer, because Darwinian evolution has risen, and as Dawkins has said, it's allowed atheists to become intellectually satisfied atheists, or that's a paraphrase, but he says something similar. So, because and now the fine-tuning argument is the teleological argument that is made by philosophers. So I'm very much sympathetic to the view from some Christian philosophers which say we ought to avoid making scientific arguments for God's existence and stick primarily to the philosophical arguments like Aquinas' 5 ways and things like that. So he brings up Now, not everyone falls into the God of the gaps. Like that's they accuse someone like William Lane Craig of making God of the gaps arguments, when in fact Dr. Craig doesn't make God of the gaps arguments, because he argues nothing can come from nothing. It's not that there's maybe some science can't explain how nothing can come from nothing, therefore God. It's that nothing can come from nothing. It's impossible. So since the universe came from nothing, the universe required a creator. So we have to make sure we're not misunderstanding and misrepresenting the arguments. But again, that's what some philosophers do say, that we should avoid the scientific arguments. I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint.
Yeah, I would agree.
Gradually painting religion into a tighter and tighter corner.
Well, I think religion needs to go back to the sort of philosophy of the early founders of the Royal Society in the mid-17th century. I mean, these were people of deep religious faith, and they saw it almost as their mission to try and understand this amazing world that God had brought into being. And so they saw all their activities as uncovering the wonders of creation, uncovering what God had done, and actually saw it as part of their worship. And I think it's important for religious people to, recapture that sense of when they do their science, it's part of their worship. I mean, when I go to my lab, I don't use sort of God language in the lab to understand immunology or the brain or whatever it is. But I am amazed by what I discover, and I see that as part of my worship. I think, uncovering what God has done in the created order is a duty that religious people have, and should be seen as part of their religious activity. So I don't think we should think of science, as it were, eroding upon the domain of religion, but rather science expanding our understanding and concept of who God is.
Let's take another example.
I would definitely agree with him there. I think in general, the term worship is not applied in the way we see it used within the Bible and through a Christian background. Worship is a lot more than a few songs in church on Sunday.
Right.
Worship can be a vast number of things, and I really like the way he put that.
Yeah, I mean, Paul in 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, or no, Romans, I believe it was Romans, where he said, offer your bodies as living sacrifice. This is your spiritual act of worship. So even offering our bodies as a living sacrifice to God is an act of worship.
And you're a worship leader, so you're like the authority on this.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if I'd say I'm the authority on what worship is, but I would, I'd say I'm very knowledgeable on music, and the music aspect at any rate. Yeah, which on a little bit of a side note, I actually just ordered a book of all the hymns of Isaac Watts in one book. So, yeah.
Cool. I have no idea who that is.
Oh, I mean, he's one of the most popular hymn writers that there's ever been. We still sing a number of his hymns. You can still find him in the hymn book. He lived around the late 1700s, I think. I want to say 1765 is popping into my head, but that could be completely wrong. So actually, hold on.
You're a wealth of music knowledge, Clinton. I love it.
Yeah, a little bit of a tangent. But now I'm a little. Now I've got to look it up, because I got to make sure the claim I just made, whether or not it's true or not.
I also need to know at least like one hymn that I might know that he did at this point.
Let's see. Okay. Well, actually, "Joy to the World" is a hymn that he wrote. He wrote the lyrics. He didn't write the music. So let's see. Oh, okay. No, he lived earlier than that. Oh God, our help in ages past.
Yep.
Oh, was an Isaac Watts hymn, and that was written in 1719. So yeah, so he was earlier than 1765. But yeah, actually, this book here has a number of hymns by him. But yeah. "Alas, and did my Savior bleed" is another one that people might know. But yeah, so he lived in the early 1700s.
Very cool.
I was writing him, so yeah.
Thank you for that tidbit.
Oh yeah, no problem. I mean, yeah,
if we don't run into our music trivia, knowledge that comes up in a show, then it's not a real show.
Right. Yeah. We gotta do more of those games. I enjoy them.
Yeah, for sure. We may be working on something fairly special. I think we're coming up on some kind of episode milestone, so we'll see.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll throw a lot of them in there for something special.
Yeah, sounds good.
And that is the proliferation of what we see often in the media of what seems to be cheap tricks purporting to be miracles that prove the existence of God.
I have to say I'm pretty skeptical. My general default position is don't believe it. And I guess that's the scientific training, isn't it? And so certainly I would come with great skepticism to all of these sort of miraculous cures and so on and so forth. And so I think there would be dangerous things to try and use probably as a justification for belief. But having said that, I personally, as a believer, I wouldn't want to exclude the possibility that God occasionally chooses to do something special. But I think to assign lots of these sort of fake kind of miracles, to God it doesn't do him any favors. It doesn't honor God in that way to say something's happened when really it's a delusion.
Again, I really like the way he put that there. I would kind of agree with that approach. When I discussed this subject with Mike Lacona, I mean, that's one of the things we talked about is, he uses an argument that does argue for supernatural being one piece of evidence here, and I think that's an issue with how to approach this, because if we attribute all these kind of things to a cause and use it as an argument for God, we're really not. It's one of those that doesn't just open the door for the Christian worldview, but it opens the worldview. It opens a door to a vast number of other worldviews. And some of them are, how shall I say this? They are more adept at fitting various spiritual, supernatural things within their worldview. So for New Age, because they believe everything is mind, essentially any supernatural, non-physical feat can fit within their worldview very easily. While as Christians, we may not always understand why a supernatural thing occurred in the way it did. It may even seem to contradict our worldview, depending on what kind of supernatural event, it is. So I agree with him there. I'm very hesitant to assign any of these things you see widely publicized, and I agree. Like, let's assume it's not real until we have solid evidence of it. And let me say this too, though. His point about exclusion is really good, because I see so many atheists write it off as no supernatural events being possible. But I think if we reach a point where we deal with all reasonable explanations and they're at least reasonably exhausted, doesn't mean we have to look at every single possibility, but any reasonable possibility is exhausted, then as a Christian, there's no reason for me not to assign a supernatural explanation to that.
Right. God may exist, but no.
Good place to stop there.
Right.
God may exist, but no argument will ever prove it. I cannot imagine any sequence of words or evidence of the senses that could prove without doubt that God exists or does not exist. There could always be another explanation. Weight of evidence, cumulative cases, inferences to the best explanation, perhaps these can work for or against God, but never conclusively. I do not tolerate fallacious proofs of God, so much so that I make a bold comparison. God, if there is a God, would be offended more by a preacher in a pulpit expounding a bad proof of God than by a soldier in a war taking God's name in vain. I'd like God to exist. Anyone who knows me knows this. But I fear believing in God based on reasons that are wrong. So, if God exists, and if God wants me to believe in God, it's up to God to figure out how. I'm sorry, but that's closer to truth.
That's Matt Dillahunty's way of reasoning.
Yeah.
I don't know if God exists, but if God exists, God would know what it would take to convince me. So it's up to God to convince me. Well, that's just bogus, fallacious reasoning. Because it could be you could be someone like Peter Boghossian, who in his book A Manual for Creating Atheists actually concedes that if he sees some kind of miraculous event like God writing "I exist" in the stars, he would probably always see it as a delusion before he would believe that God exists. So if you're going to take the position that I don't know what it would take to convince me, but God would know, well, then you're probably always going to remain skeptical for a bad reason. And personally, we might even use Pascal's wager here, because if there are reasons for God to exist, then it seems like the smarter thing to do would be to believe in God, because either God exists or God doesn't exist. And even if all the arguments are wrong, would you rather believe in God for bad reasons, or would you rather believe in God for bad reasons if God doesn't exist, or reject God's existence for bad reasons if God does exist?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I don't see how people can kind of, I try and wrap my mind around how people would take it this way, and to take that purely, I won't say naturalistic, but that approach that, it's going to have to be something that only God knows that can convince me. Yeah, I don't see why, looking at the cumulative case and really making some inferences as to what our best explanations are, they make it, that makes the most sense to me for many of the reasons you just gave.
Yeah, so I wonder how Robert Kahn would respond to Pascal's wager.
That's a good question.
Because Pascal's wager is not an argument for God's existence. It's more like, just taking into account that, considering the evidence that we have for God's existence, it seems like you have more to gain you have more to gain if God does exist, and more to lose if God does exist, depending on whether you believe in him or not.
Right.
So,
you know what? Let's see if he has a video on it real quick.
Oh, on Pascal's wager?
Yeah. Out of curiosity, so we could interact with it a little bit. I'm not seeing anything, no. Not from his channel, anyway.
Yeah. I don't think any modern philosophers, except maybe Peter Kraft, actually use Pascal's wager anymore. So unless he interviewed Peter Kraft, I don't know if he would have ever really come across Pascal's wager, or at least an academic defense of it.
Right, because most of the versions you see of it from both Christians and atheists are not even close to kind of what we're actually looking at with it.
Yeah, the Pascal's wager comes from his book Pensée, and the vast majority of people who defend it and the vast majority of people who critique it have never actually read his book Pensée, so they've never actually read the argument in context, and you can tell, you can tell just by what they say about it, and so, yeah.
All right. Well, it didn't take us long to finish that one up. In general, your overall thoughts on the video?
Yeah, well, I have no problems with Robert Kahn's overall. I don't want to say mission, but overall, I guess his overall plan or whatever to really see if there are good reasons to believe in God. Because I went through a phase like that too, and thankfully I came across some good Christian thinkers who kept me grounded in reason to continue believing in the faith. So I have no problem with his overall, methodology here of trying to see if there are good arguments for God's existence. But based on some of the things he said, it seems like he is unfairly giving weight to atheism, because there were really bad arguments for atheism, and you didn't really hear any good, compelling reasons to reject belief in God from any of the atheists that Robert interacted with or interviewed. So I do think, based on his comments, he's unfairly weighting, the God not existing over God existing.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I thought overall the video is excellent in terms of production value, all that good stuff.
Definitely well produced.
I definitely enjoy hearing other people's opinions, even when I disagree with them. But like you said, yeah, I think while he's trying to be fairly neutral in this, like you said, he's not giving quite as much weight to theist on some of this, even if he disagrees with their arguments. I'm not sure how much he's actually putting on it. But aside from I've done blanked on his name already.
Which one?
The second to last guy.
Oh, Walter Sennett Armstrong?
Yeah.
No. Walter Sennett Armstrong was the second.
Yeah, aside from him, I really liked everybody for the most part. Even they were well spoken, even if they were off base a little bit on some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. I feel like I could learn a lot from them. And now I'm even maybe a little more anxious about Walter Sennett Armstrong, listening to some more of what he has to say, because I'd really like a better opinion of him than I have from just that clip.
Yeah. I'm not too familiar with his work, so you don't know what arguments he makes, but it was refreshing to hear people who actually say, I believe God does not exist. They're not taking the cop out of I just don't believe in God.
Right.
So you have the burden of proving God exists to me. It's refreshing to see people not take that way out.
I agree. I can respect someone who at least is willing to take on and defend that position. All right. Well, no questions are coming in currently, so don't have any Q&A to do for the moment. So where can listeners find more of you? Any events or anything coming up for people to look out for?
Well, I have no current events scheduled because, of course, it's difficult during lockdown. January is coming up in a few months, and I usually do some traveling and do some speaking in January. South Carolina, I usually go do a brief little speaking tour there. And this year in January, I actually did a breakout session at a conference in New Orleans. And so I don't know if that's still going to happen or if they're not because of coronavirus. And if that goes on, then I'd love to, go back there and do another breakout session if they'll have me. So that might go on in January if it's going to happen again. Other than that, I have nothing currently scheduled, as far as like speaking engagements, but I do other things. I've published articles on a blog, so you can find me at the Life Training Institute blog at www.prolifetraining.com. You can find the blog there. And I've published at blog.secularprolife.org, which is the Secular Pro-Life blog. You can find me on Facebook or Twitter. And, I still have my pro-life podcast called Pro-Life Thinking also. which you can find on Facebook, but you can also find me on find the podcast on iTunes. You can download us there and listen to us.
Y'all have some good conversations. I've enjoyed what I've listened to.
Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah, I've actually been getting some good feedback from listeners too about about what they like and about what I could do to improve the podcast also. Because I'm not the greatest interviewer. I think I'm pretty decent at it. I've gotten a lot better since I started, but still got some good feedback and stuff that I'm going to institute with my future interviews. So I do have some interviews coming up that I'm trying to schedule, and I want to get back into producing some more weekly content too.
Very cool.
So,
well,
yeah.
Keep it up. We enjoy you being on here as well. So.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I enjoy doing it. I like our conversations.
Yeah, it's always fun. It's different.
Yeah.
If you enjoy this kind of stuff, you can also go over on YouTube or Facebook and check out Question Christianity. It's another apologetics group where we invite dissenting views and welcome conversation. Currently, we're taking on a lot of current challenges to the cross. So we're looking at a lot of contemporary issues that are coming up in culture. So we're looking at critical theory. We're looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. We're looking at things like QAnon coming up as well. So that's a good place to go if you want to check out another show on those kind of issues. Question Christianity. If you put it in exclamation in a parentheses, quotation marks. Took me 3 times to get there. Thanks for that. Yeah, quotation marks on YouTube. You'll be able to find it. We're not quite big enough to get pulled in by the algorithm just yet. So quotation marks around Question Christianity. You'll be able to pull it up.
Yeah.
So yeah, and in the meantime, you're already over here on the Mentionables channel. So subscribe, hit notifications. We try and put out content at least weekly. So we've got a couple different shows planned coming up. So if you enjoy live apologetics, and we always try and interact with chat or questions when it comes in, show up for that, and we'll have a conversation. That's all I got.
All right.
We will roll the outro.